Senhoras e senhores, dando continuidade então ao segundo Encontro Internacional de Gestão de Competências em Qualidade de Vida no Trabalho, vamos compor a mesa da Conferência Internacional Realidade da Qualidade de Vida nas Melhores Empresas para se Trabalhar, no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos. Convidamos então o Dr. Robert Levering, da The Great Place to Work Institute. Convidamos o professor Carlos Faquina, da Nestlé, Departamento de RH, FESP, USP e Mackenzie. Em seguida, o professor Miguel Caldas, da FGV. Eu passo a palavra então ao professor Miguel, que será o mediador.
Ok. Boa tarde, meu nome é Miguel Caldas. Antes de mais nada, eu gostaria de dar também as nossas boas-vindas a todos os presentes, participantes, e agradecer mais uma vez pelo convite de estar aqui de novo no Encontro de Gestão de Competências em Qualidade de Vida no Trabalho. Minha função é uma função que eu diria mais fácil do que foi no ano passado, que foi, neste caso, fazer a mediação do que eu imagino será um excelente debate entre duas pessoas das quais pouco sabia antes de fato estar aqui sendo convidado, mas das quais eu tentei pesquisar ao máximo nas últimas semanas. O professor Dr. Robert Levering, ele trabalha no The Great Place to Work Institute, é autor de boa parte das pesquisas, pelo que entendi, sobre as 100 melhores empresas para se trabalhar na América e em outros lugares. Seus livros sobre o tema e sobre essa pesquisa são muito conhecidos e divulgados geralmente na Fortune ao final de cada ano. Eu gostaria muito também de agradecer ao Dr. Kemper pela sua visita ao nosso país, dar de novo as boas-vindas e a calorosa recepção que nos cabe. Obrigado. Também gostaríamos de apresentar o Dr. Carlos Faquina, ele é da área de recursos humanos da Nestlé, e estaremos também ouvindo um pouco sua opinião a respeito de, fundamentalmente, como fica a qualidade de vida no trabalho nestas melhores empresas para se trabalhar. Eu pretendo basicamente passar a palavra aos meus colegas, fazer uma pequena discussão no final e talvez, se sobrar algum tempo, termos um espaço o máximo que for possível para algum debate, alguma intervenção dos senhores. Só um pouquinho sobre mim, eu sou professor da Escola de Administração de Empresas de São Paulo, da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, na área de mudança organizacional. Não sou um técnico de qualidade de vida no trabalho e me considero, na verdade, um admirador da iniciativa e, novamente, um curioso. Então, vamos, sem mais de mim, vamos para o Dr. Robert Levering, que vai fazer agora a sua exposição. Obrigado.
Boa tarde. Prefiro falar em português, mas posso dizer bom dia e obrigada de nada, mas uma palestra é demais. I'm going to talk in English, of course, but I'm going to give you my resume, which is fairly easy because my resume is essentially the books and magazine articles I've written for the last 20 or 25 years. And most of my work has really been revolved around this idea that started in 1981, and it became a book called The 100 Best Companies to Work For in America. Now, like all good ideas, it wasn't mine. It was the idea of an editor in New York. And I had done some other books with my co-author, Milton Moskowitz, and she called me one day, and she said, how would you like to do a book entitled The 100 Best Companies to Work For in America? And I said, are there any? I said, I know I can do a book called The 100 Worst Companies to Work For in America, because I used to be a labor reporter. And she said, we don't have enough lawyers to do the book that you want to do, so why don't you try to do the book I want you to do? So my co-author Milton and I spent the next 2 years, from 1981 actually until 1984, going throughout the United States trying to find companies that we thought would qualify for this book. What we did is that each of the companies that was a candidate for our book, we actually went there and interviewed the employees. And very much appropriate to the topic of this conference, what we were essentially asking is, what do you think about the quality of work life here? Do you think this is basically a place where you have a high quality of life? Okay. And anyway, the book was very, very popular. It was a bestseller in the United States. And so we did the book again in 1993 and did the same process where we went and visited 150 companies, 150 candidate companies, and published the book again in 1993. And then we got in touch with Fortune magazine. And so 3 years ago, we started doing the research for doing this as a magazine article. And about the same time, we got in touch with Azami magazine, who was interested. They have an editor there who was very interested in doing the same kind of project for Brazil. What's interesting is that the process we use in both for Fortune magazine and in Brazil for Azami magazine is the same. We use an employee survey that we created. It's called the Great Place to Work Trust Index. And it's a survey that tries to ask employees what they think about working there. Do they like it there? Do they find that there's good communications and so on? Now, what happens is that if you look at, in general, what we are discovering, in other words, the criteria for qualification of our list is that these are the qualities that they show. They're places with better communications, where people feel that there's higher level of camaraderie, where they're companies that they feel proud because of the contribution the company makes to the community. It's more egalitarian. People are more involved in the decision making about their jobs. And there's less stress, which I know is one of the issues you have here. But anyway, how do I know this? That's because that's what our questionnaire talks about. It talks about all of these issues. And the companies that make our list score higher on these issues than the companies that don't make our list. It's that simple. So, in other words, to identify these companies is to identify companies that have a very high quality of work life. Now, let me give you an example of just one of these issues and how it affects the quality of work life. I said that they tend to have much better communications internally. So I'm going to describe a vicious cycle that a lot of people experience at work, where when change is initiated, there's poor communications in the sense that incomplete information goes out. Well, now what happens when there's incomplete information? It means that there's gaps. Right? There's gaps. Now, probably it's a law of society, of people anyway, of human groups, that all gaps must be filled, right? And especially an information gap. If you don't know what's going on, you have to fill that gap. So how do you fill it if the management didn't do a good job of giving you the information or doesn't have mechanisms for you to ask questions? You ask somebody who may not know anything. So in other words, you fill the gap oftentimes with rumors or with incomplete information. or with people who don't really understand what's going on, but they have an answer anyway. Well, the most important part of this vicious cycle is that what does that do to the individual? What does that do to the individual? It means the individual is more isolated. See? Because they don't quite know who to trust. They don't quite know what's going on. They know that really the gap may have been filled with somebody who's always fills in information, and they may not know what they're talking about. Anyway, but what this does to the individual is that they feel isolated. And it also means that they don't have as much credibility in the management of the organization, right? Because the management created the situation where they're more isolated. Now, organizationally, what happens? I'd say two things happen. One is that because people feel more isolated, the company tends to have more turnover. See, if you don't feel connected with the rest of the organization, if you're able to, you'll leave. The other problem for the organization, for the individuals in the organization who stay, the ones who may not have other alternatives, that they're under more stress. Because people who are acting with incomplete information have to take a lot of this on themselves. So it's more stressful. But anyway, this is one time around this circle. You go around this circle again and again and again. You see, you have an organization that has very serious problems, not only organizationally with the higher turnover and less quality because people aren't cooperating as well, but you also have a problem because people are under more stress, so the quality of work life is worse. Now, in a much better workplace, what happens, there's much more complete information is given to people. But the most important part of this is that in a really good workplace, what we have found is that they have good two-way communications. They have feedback mechanisms, so they don't rely just on the information going out, but it's also the information coming back. So that as a result of that, people are able to be more committed to the organization because they know what's going on, and they're able to cooperate with other people. And this results in, for the organization, much higher quality, there's a much higher level of innovation, and much more loyalty. So that's just taking one example that I was talking about, about what these qualities, the qualities of companies that have a higher quality of work life, companies that are on our Fortune list or the Azami list. Now, most companies would not qualify for that book that I wanted to write, The 100 Worst Companies to Work For in America. I mean, most companies are not terrible, but most of them aren't great. So the question I've really been focused on for many, many years is what is really the difference between a good company or an okay company and a really great company? Because there's so much competition to get on the lists that I've been working on, I know that I'm dealing with the very best of the best. And so the question is really, what's the difference between good and great? After I completed the book, The 100 Best, the first time in 1984, I wrote another book. It took me 3 years, and it was called A Great Place to Work. And it just asked this question, what is a great place to work? What did I find that the very best of the 100, what did they have in common? So I went back to 20 of those companies, and I especially interviewed the founders of the company, like the head of Hewlett-Packard, David Packard, the founder of that company, and I interviewed a number of other companies that were the head of Federal Express, Fred Smith, and I looked over all the data that I had, and I thought I would be able to come with a magic formula. I thought that what a great place to work would really boil down to certain policies and practices. And I spent 1 year trying to come up with a magic formula, and I failed. I totally failed. Now, why did I fail? Basically, I kept finding counterexamples to what I was trying to put on my list. For instance, There's a company called Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And at that company, if you go to lunch there, they have the menu, and on the left side of the menu are the items that you can order, and on the right side, they just have calories. Okay, how many calories are in their pies? How many calories are in their steaks, and so on. But the price isn't on the list. Why? Because they have a free lunch. Yes, there is a free lunch. It's at Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. Okay? So when I interviewed at Northwestern Mutual Life, and I said, why is this a great place to work? People would say, among other things, they say, because we have a free lunch. Okay? Anyway, you get the idea. Some companies had profit sharing. You go to a company that has a good profit sharing plan, they say, well, one of the reasons this is a great place to work is because we have profit sharing. And then the one I thought was the central one I thought was employee ownership. And I interviewed at some companies that had 100% employee ownership. And they said, that's why this is a great place to work, because it's employee owned. So I thought, no matter what else, of course, not all the companies had free lunch or anything like that, but I thought that, well, maybe it wouldn't be 100% employee ownership, but it might be the fact that they would have some sense of ownership. See? So I thought on my magic list I would have employee ownership. Well, it turns out that while I was doing the research, I read about 2 companies. One was a meat packing company in the Middle West of the United States. The other one was a auto parts manufacturer that made ball bearings for automobiles, and they were located in New Jersey. And these 2 companies had 3 things in common. First, they were both 100% employee-owned. Second, they both had just gone out of business. And third, why had they gone out of business? They both went out of business because of labor problems. So obviously, employee ownership wasn't the key to having a great place to work. At any rate, long story short, I could not come up with a list of policies and practices, but I could come up with a definition. And the definition I came up with was the following: that a great place to work, this is what all the employees in really great places to work would say. They would agree with this statement, that it's a place where they trust the people they work for, they have pride in what they do, and enjoy the people they work with. I'm going to have that on the next slide, so don't fear. I know some of you are still writing with it. Okay. So in other words, it's an issue of relationships. So what I was saying was that the first relationship, and the most important, is the relationship of the employee and the management. And that's where I discovered that people felt that they had a high level of trust in the management. The second one was they had pride in their work. The relationship with the job was very good. And thirdly, they liked working with the people they worked with. They enjoyed the people they worked with. There was a high level of camaraderie. But all 3 of these were elements of a really great place to work. Now what's important here is that I'm saying is that what's central to a great place to work is the relationships, that these relationships are great, not that there's specific policies and practices. In other words, how this is accomplished varies very widely from company to company, but it is something that's true in how the effect of it is still true. One other thing about this definition and this concept is that you can have one and not the other 2, or you can have 2 but not 3. In other words, a great place to work is good in all of these aspects. Now, I'll give 2 examples. One's my wife and one's my father. Okay? My wife, she used to be a university professor. And you ask my wife, she was a professor at the University of California. And you asked her at the time, do you have a great job? She'd say yes. You know, she said she loved working with students, she loved the research, she loved the intellectual stimulation of the environment. But if you asked her, so in other words, in terms of pride in the job, it was extreme, extraordinary. But do you work in a great place? And she'd say no. Why? She always had two reasons. One, politics. Academic politics. It was always a big fight going on, about something. Now, since a lot of you are from the university, I don't know whether you've ever heard the story about Henry Kissinger, that how he used to say that the problem with academic politics is that the stakes are so low. Okay. I don't know if that makes sense, but anyway. Okay, the other reason that she said she didn't like working at the university was she did not like the bureaucracy, that the school had too much bureaucracy, and in a lot of ways, bureaucracy is the opposite of trust. See, bureaucracy is lots of rules, and that sort of is a manifestation of distrust. Okay, so that's why, although she loved her job, she did not think it was a great place to work. Now, the other example is my father. My father worked for an airline for 40 years. It was Trans World Airlines. And during much of the time that he was there, the owner of the airline was a man named Howard Hughes. Remember Howard Hughes? If you know nothing else about Howard Hughes, you probably know that he was crazy. And so my dad worked for a crazy man for 40 years. Okay? In that environment, the employees really liked each other because they never knew what was coming on from on top. So there was a tremendous camaraderie among the employees. You see? But was it a great place to work? No, nobody trusts a crazy man, right? And my father sure didn't. So it was not a great place to work, but it was fun in a certain kind of way for the employees. Anyway, so I'm saying, my point is that this definition, as I'm trying to say that all of these elements have to be in place to be a great place to work. Now, what's the most important of these three? It's the trust. Now, what is trust? Now, this is, of course, a very easy thing to do. It's just to talk about trust, and we'll do that in 5 minutes and have a whole explanation of trust. Now, as I see it, trust has three parts. The first part is, what do I think about the other person? What do I think about the other person? When you think about whether you can trust somebody, it starts with whether you can believe them. Can you believe what they have to say to you? Another question, do you find them competent? In other words, you're not going to trust somebody if you think that they don't know what they're doing, that they don't know how to accomplish tasks, they always make serious mistakes, you're not going to really trust them. Another issue is whether you think they have integrity. What you think about somebody a lot depends on whether you think they follow through on promises, whether they actually do what they say they're going to do. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a very brief video that will illustrate this point about credibility. And this is taken from a company that's a hardware company. It's a hardware company. But by hardware, I don't mean computers. I mean hammers and nails and screwdrivers, okay? Now, this hardware company is what you're going to see is they are having a retreat of the senior management, about the 200 top people. The name of the company is W.W. Granger. And they are going to describe what it is that they're doing differently. Okay? So can we have the video, the first video? Okay. Now, the reason I am showing that video is that it points out a very important point about trust, that it really starts with vulnerability. In other words, that the management has to be more open to people than simply giving information and staying in an ivory tower. And that what we found with really good workplaces is that they usually have extremely good mechanisms for the management of the company to be open to the individuals, so that people can ask questions, so that the communications can really be genuinely two-way. But sometimes it's awkward. And that is a good example of how it can be awkward, and there does have to be some vulnerability. But a result of that vulnerability, you see, is that you would trust this man more than if he's always, you know, always very much on an ivory tower and you can't have any contact with him. Okay. The second part about trust is, what do I think the other person thinks about me? And that's what I'd call respect. In other words, do I feel respected? In other words, you could feel that somebody is very, very competent. He's an absolutely, you know, extraordinarily good in terms of communications, that they have high integrity, always delivers on their promises. But some ways, the way they behave towards you is not very respectful. You don't think they have your best interests at heart. Now, how is that shown in the workplace? A lot of it has to do with people being given a sense that the company cares about them as individuals. And I think that a lot of the quality of work-life issues are in this issue of respect. That people feel treated as individuals, as human beings in some other role than merely a role of employee. So that there would be policies and practices that would be helpful for people who have families, that people feel respected more when they are involved in decision making, and people feel more respected if the company has methods for training and for personal development, for professional development. Those are the issues, those are respect issues. And the third area is fairness. And this is an issue that you may not, you may have a situation where you feel a high degree of credibility in the management and you feel like they respect you, but for a variety of reasons, you know, like either the way the pay system is done or the way that the promotions are made, that you don't feel like it's a fair environment. Now, just very quickly, how do companies become great places to work? What are the things that they are required that I've discovered over the years? Well, first off, there has to be a commitment to be a great place to work. There has to be a decision by the people that run the company that they want to have a great workplace. And this I've found in every good company, that there is that commitment. The second one is that policies and practices are important, but they're only important insofar as they express a level of trust. In other words, a company can put in a policy, let's say a daycare center on site, but people could feel like that's an expression of a paternalistic relationship rather than because the company really cares about the fact that some people have children and that have a personal problem with that. You see, so that the issues are relationship issues, not just policies and practices. And the third part is that the leadership of the organization has to be trained to learn what it means to be credible, to respect people, and to be fair. In other words, they have to foster trust at all times. There's an interesting Brazilian company, Accor, which has Ticket and a bunch of hotels, Sofitel, Novotel, and so on. And they've developed a very good way of expressing their philosophy, their people philosophy. They call it people, service, profit. And you can see how they express it. But anyway, the idea is this, that the management of the organization focuses on creating a good work environment for the people. Then the people will deliver a better service, and then the company will make more money. In other words, instead of the focus being on the profit first, they say focus on the people first. Another company that is a real interesting one to me, because 10 years ago, Continental Airlines would have ranked very high on the book that I wanted to do. It was one of the worst employers in the world, and it was because they had a president who was a terrible boss. Well, how do I know that? Well, the magazine I write for, Fortune magazine, his picture was on the cover. His name was Frank Lorenzo, and his picture was on the cover, and the cover said, "America's Meanest Boss." Okay, that was the president of this company 10 years ago. Well, in the last 5 years, the two people that are in the bottom right corner of this picture have decided that they're going to make a really different kind of workplace, a really different kind of company where people will really work together. Now, when we do our survey with the 100 best companies, we send out these surveys to several hundred surveys to each of the candidate companies. Last year, we received back in the United States about 27,000 surveys. With Azami, this year we're going to have over 30,000 surveys returned, so it's a lot of data. And in the United States last year, we had 12,000 of the employees wrote us, they answered this question: what makes this place a great place to work? Please be specific. Okay, I'm just going to read you two of them from Continental Airlines. The first one, the person wrote, his answer was, Frank is gone. Okay. Now this other person said that, he says that the reason this is such a great place to work is that they have really do care about the people who work here. He said, it used to be that I was ashamed to say that I work for Continental Airlines. But today, I'm more proud of the fact that I work for Continental Airlines than anything else in my life. How did they do it? Where I said the first thing was that they had to create a clear statement that a good quality workplace was an objective of the organization. And the last point here, in their plan that they created 5 years ago, was that they had to work together. And then they had to develop some policies and practices that worked. Now I'm just going to tell you 3 of them. Ten years ago, and even 5 years ago, every month, the Department of Transportation in the United States does a list of the punctuality of the airlines, how on time the flights are. And so they do a list to say which airline is, the highest percentage of flights are on time and who's got the lowest percentage. And 5 and 10 years ago, Continental was last, dead last, or almost last, every single month. Well, when they decided they were going to work together, they said, well, we should do something, because this is very, very expensive to us to always be last. I mean, aside from the embarrassment of being last on the list, it's also something that costs us a lot of money, because a lot of customers go to other airlines because they can't rely on us. So they said, why don't we do a policy where every time we are in the top 3 of that list, everybody in the company will get $65. Okay, every month that we're on the top 3. Within a year, they were in the top 3. And they're in the top 3 almost every month now. Another policy they have, perfect attendance. It used to be that there was the only reward that person would get for being on, or the only thing that would happen with being on time was that you would not be punished. Okay. Now they do a thing that every 3 months, every individual who has perfect attendance receives, or their name goes into a lottery, and they pick from the lottery, and they pick 6 employees who get a new automobile, and they get a Ford Explorer. So this has had a tremendous effect on their attendance. And the last policy that they've developed is job swapping. That individuals who have something else, this I think is a very, very good one in terms of quality of work life. They say that if we're going to work together, the most important thing is we have to trust people that they want to get the job done. But sometimes things happen to people, like their children graduate from high school, or their children are sick, or there's some other commitment that people have, that they would rather do that rather than work. So they have a policy that as long as you get the job done, you can have somebody else take your job, take your place. last year, so like for instance, if a flight attendant is supposed to go on an event or on a flight, she can switch with another flight attendant if like her child is going to graduate from high school that day. Anyway, 40% of the employees participate in this in one way or another in the course of a year. Tremendous policy. Okay. Very quickly, I want to just say that even though these companies, that we pick them purely on the basis of workplace environment, that there's some really good financial news as well. When we did the book in 1984, we discovered that our companies, compared to the stock market average, were twice as good in terms of earnings per share. After we did the book in 1993, a very similar study, but this time they tried to study what the stock market average, if you put $100,000 in the companies 10 years before, what would that have resulted in? It would have come up to $260,000. As compared to the companies that we had, they were actually worth, the total return on investment was $450,000. And the same thing was true again when we did the process with Fortune, that the companies that we picked over the previous decade had twice the return on investment of other companies. Now, let's see, I have another video, but I wonder, maybe I could save that for the very end, or I could.
Whatever you say. The thing is, we do have another speaker in about only 20 minutes to have some sort of debate. That'll be good. That'll be good because people get. Okay, great.
Okay, what we've decided, we've only got 20 more minutes apparently. So you will get the video. I understand that I will have many enemies here if we don't show the video. Okay. But we'll do the video after our next speaker and after you have some questions. And it's a purely fun video, and it shows a company, as you'll see, the man who's up there in the sky there, that's the CEO of this company, Southwest Airlines, all right? And what the point of the video, and the point that I've been trying to say, is that I've had the great opportunity of looking at companies where people can be themselves at, where the quality of life is very, very high. And I'm very, very happy to tell you about this and tell you that any company can be this way. And that it's something that, and that the companies are very successful, as you've seen, and that this is something that is really good news, and I really congratulate you on coming together to discuss this, because this is one of the most important things, is the quality of work life in where we work, because that's how we spend most of our time. So thank you very much.
Bem, agora a gente gostaria de introduzir o Sr. Carlos Facchini. A gente vai ouvir um pouquinho sobre a perspectiva brasileira das melhores empresas para se trabalhar.
First of all, my congratulations for your speech. It's very interesting. But I will speak in Portuguese because the main quality of life in Brazil is talking Portuguese, because there are a lot of people who don't understand English there. So, my apologies for you, but I'm talking in português. Em primeiro lugar, eu estou bastante de acordo com as colocações do conferencista por uma razão egocêntrica. A metodologia do professor não permitiu que a Nestlé entrasse por 2 vezes já nas melhores empresas para se trabalhar. Então eu sou obrigado a agradecê-lo pela sua ajuda, porque nós em 2 anos em sequência tivemos o prazer de constar da lista da Exame como, não sei se é the best ou the great, mas uma boa empresa para se trabalhar. Eu procurei anotar 3 áreas que eu julgo fundamentais. Em primeiro lugar, o que é que as empresas estão procurando hoje? Elas estão procurando possibilidades de serem menos imitadas. O professor Markovitch falava da inovação como um elemento fundamental que só existe em empresas que têm qualidade de vida. Então, inovação, renovação, mudança, todo esse processo está muito ligado à empresa que tem qualidade de vida. E qualidade de vida é um nome melhor do que qualidade no trabalho, porque é mais amplo. Nós estamos falando da qualidade de vida do todo da pessoa. Se observar com cuidado, finanças, dinheiro para adquirir a empresa está disponível. Qualquer empresa com um cabedal razoável, eu cito agora o caso da Philip Morris, que adquiriu a Kibon por quase $1 bilhão, não é? Então, se compram para a empresa. Produto, por mais inovação que a gente faça, por mais que a gente consiga inovar, o tempo de cópia, de imitação, é de, no máximo, 1 ano. Estou falando de indústria de alimentos, talvez em outras indústrias seja diferente, mas na nossa indústria o tempo é muito pequeno. Em média, 6 meses. Processos, um pouco mais complicado. Quando eu tenho algum processo mais sofisticado, 1 aninho o pessoal já consegue chegar perto. E o que é mais difícil imitar? Gente. Isso é mais complicado. E eu ligaria 2 fatores básicos. De um lado, pessoas, e de outro lado, a organização. Aquilo que nós chamamos de clima organizacional. Uma empresa hoje que conseguir ter gente, pessoas com competências críticas requeridas, mas principalmente pessoas envolvidas dentro do processo e dos objetivos, mas sobretudo nos valores que essa empresa tem uma possibilidade de competitividade extremamente superior a qualquer outra empresa. Porque para copiar organização e sistema de organização e de envolvimento, o tempo para imitar é praticamente 3 vezes mais do que o tempo para imitar produto ou processo. Só que nós levamos algumas décadas para descobrir isso, por mais paradoxal que seja. E no Brasil, talvez nós começamos a descobrir isso a partir de 95. Por quê? Porque até 95 ou 94, com o Plano Real, nós conseguimos encobrir as nossas deficiências. A inflação não é só um problema de que a camada mais pobre da população ou as pessoas que ganham menos estão desprotegidas porque não têm onde aplicar o dinheiro, aquela coisa que todo mundo aqui sabe. A inflação é mais perversa porque ela dilui todas as nossas incapacidades empresariais. Ela não permite medir absolutamente nada. Simplesmente porque nós transferimos para o preço, ou transferimos para os preços, toda a nossa ineficiência. E acabou. Era simples. Nós éramos ineficientes em A, B e C, juntávamos A, B e C e o consumidor pagava. De 95 para cá, começamos a descobrir que gente era importante. Embora o discurso sempre foi que gente é importante. E aqui eu entro na primeira observação, in your first observation in terms of credibility, when you need to put together, side by side, the speech and the reality, the policies and the practices. Okay? Nesse momento, nós temos que fazer um exercício muito, muito forte para ligar as duas coisas. Eu tenho, entre vida acadêmica e empresa, aproximadamente, eu não vou revelar, mas uns 30 aninhos já. Dá para calcular a idade. E o discurso que gente é importante não é novidade para ninguém nesse auditório. Só que agora nós estamos observando o que efetivamente é. Só que dentro de uma perspectiva diferente da perspectiva que nós encarávamos, talvez erroneamente, pessoas como fatores importantes. E a expectativa é a passagem de um processo paternalista para um processo contratual. O que vai existir hoje e está existindo cada vez mais? Nós não podemos mais achar que gente é importante porque eu converso um pouquinho mais com o indivíduo ou porque eu pergunto a ele como a família dele está indo. Isso é importante, Mas aquelas atitudes paternalistas, de protecionismo ou de pseudo-orientação tendem a desaparecer e no seu lugar fica uma realidade contratual. E essa realidade contratual é: eu tenho competências críticas, ou seja, competências profissionais e habilidades gerenciais, que é mais difícil tê-las do que competências profissionais, e a empresa precisa disso. E eu faço esse casamento. O que vai existir, então, é um outro momento importante que o professor apresentou muito bem, que é a relação de credibilidade. E aí entra o aspecto, na minha opinião, mais importante das suas propostas, que é a forma, a maneira como o gerente, o manager, age. Normalmente, até bem pouco tempo, a ação do manager era exatamente oposta em termos da sua prédica, do seu discurso. Porque existia aquilo que o professor Markovic lançou no primeiro momento, uma espécie de simbiose entre poder e retenção da informação. E com a retenção da informação, a outra parte fundamental para uma empresa ser importante, que é o processo de comunicação, simplesmente não existia. Porque eu tinha uma estrutura vertical. Em cada estrutura vertical, cada indivíduo que ocupava um quadradinho, ele tinha a crença de que, retendo a informação dentro do seu conhecimento, ele retinha o poder. E era assim mesmo. Então, a passagem do conhecimento privado para um conhecimento network é fundamental em termos de credibilidade. Mas, para isso, nós temos uma tarefa muito forte ainda e muito grande nas empresas hoje. Ainda a área de decisão, a área de visão estratégica da empresa, ou seja, a direção, a alta direção, está muito distante das pessoas que executam as tarefas. Entre essas pessoas que pensam o estratégico e pensam o desenvolvimento da empresa e as pessoas que executam, existe um sem número de elementos que ocupam posições gerenciais e que fazem uma espécie de filtro tanto do aspecto estratégico como do aspecto da execução. Enquanto nós não conseguirmos aproximar a área operacional da área que pensa, nós vamos ter uma dicotomia extremamente nefasta ao desenvolvimento, quer da credibilidade, quer do aspecto de comunicação. E por terceiro e por último, uma observação não crítica, mas simplesmente porque eu pouco tenho a criticar, porque a metodologia é uma metodologia que nós estamos praticando, estamos seguindo, é que, efetivamente, nós temos que levar em consideração a visão das pessoas. O professor, quando falava da visão da esposa dele como professora universitária e do pai, ele mostra exatamente as duas dimensões bastante diferentes de como as pessoas encaram a sua própria característica e a sua própria qualidade de vida. É por isso que nós temos um programa, e esse nome não é mais adequado, mas falamos então do programa de qualidade de vida. A nossa luta é, primeiro, que a pessoa se coloque como autodesenvolvimentista do seu próprio projeto de qualidade de vida. O que nós podemos fazer é oferecer às pessoas determinadas situações, oferecer determinados elementos, mas vai caber sempre a ele olhar-se, observar, e ele se encaixar dentro dos parâmetros que para ele significa qualidade de vida. E para ele é o elemento mais importante para que ele possa se envolver e para que ele possa efetivamente se olhar. Aí nós entramos na última observação, que é o equilíbrio. Não existe processo de qualidade de vida se não houver entre a prática e o discurso uma coerência, mas sobretudo um equilíbrio entre o que a empresa deseja e o que o indivíduo deseja. Esses dois parâmetros não muito levados em consideração, normalmente o foco é o que a empresa deseja e muito poucas vezes a gente observa o que o indivíduo deseja, e nós estamos falando agora em criar valores comuns. Então, a nossa grande tarefa é ter alguns valores comuns em que as pessoas possam realmente se olhar dentro de um objetivo básico e que permita à empresa e ao indivíduo justapor-se e observar-se em termos de autodesenvolvimento. Eram as minhas observações. Obrigado.
Bom, eu gostaria de dizer o seguinte: eu estou tentando desesperadamente conseguir alguns minutos a mais para a gente poder aproveitar o debate, mas foi bom esse aperto de tempo que estão me dando, porque pelo menos eu corto a minha fala. Mas, muito bem. Para isso, eu gostaria de, antes de mais nada, agradecer aos dois palestrantes e pedir à audiência, né, se gostaria de colocar algumas questões. Para isso, nós estamos pedindo ainda, dentro do padrão da conferência, que a gente possa estar colocando isso em papelzinhos. Não vai dar, provavelmente, para responder a todas elas. Então, eu gostaria de fazer o seguinte esquema: se alguém já tem uma pronta, eu queria abrir, né, e vocês passam para as pessoas que estão em volta de vocês, os demais papelzinhos, que enquanto essa primeira ou segunda pergunta está sendo respondida, eu organizo as demais. Tudo bem? Alguém quer se candidatar? Só 3 de cada vez, por favor. Eu quero. Ótimo, obrigado. Se puderem também, se quiserem se identificar para conversar depois com os palestrantes, também o façam. Se não, tudo bem, a gente vai organizar aqui. Ok, tem uma pergunta feita em inglês, o que eu suponho que vai ser para o Robert. So, I'll read it. Regarding the internal communication of more focused the internal marketing communication, what is the weight you give to the subject to improve the life quality into the organization? So, regarding internal communication, or more focus on that, the internal marketing communication, endomarketing, that's what they call it here. What is the weight you give to internal marketing into improving life quality? Então a pergunta é: que peso ele dá ao marketing interno, comunicação de marketing interno, endomarketing, dentro do quesito de comunicação interna para melhorar a qualidade de vida? Eu traduzi razoavelmente? Espero.
The quick answer to that is that our survey has 55 questions. There's 3 specifically on the question of internal communications. And I don't know whether that is... I mean, there's specifically 3 out of the 55 questions that are related directly to the internal communications. However, we have discovered that the responses on those 3 questions have a big impact on many of the other questions on the survey. In other words, that when we've done correlations of the questions with each other, we found that those questions are have the most leverage. If that makes sense. There's 2 other questions that are very, very powerful questions. One has to do with whether people feel appreciated for the work they do. In other words, which is the simple way of saying to people, does the management say thank you? And that was the second one that was very, very important in terms of the overall results. And the third one that has actually the single highest correlation is a question that reads, that I feel cared about as an individual, not just an employee. So that those are the 3 biggest, the 3 issues that are the most powerful on the questionnaire that we have.
Ok. Bom, enquanto a gente espera mais, por favor, no CFM. Are you okay? Eu gostaria de colocar uma outra questão aqui, ela se insere dentro de outra que eu queria colocar. Então, já que não temos uma multidão de perguntas, eu gostaria de colocar uma, que na verdade vale para os dois. Me pediram um pouco para fazer um pouco do anteparo, que tem se discutido essa questão de melhores empresas para se trabalhar, também sob o ponto de vista acadêmico. E eu basicamente pesquisei um pouco sobre o assunto e eu vi 2 principais colocações que foram feitas. Provavelmente você já deve ter respondido isso umas 200 vezes. A primeira questão que é feita é até que ponto, né, embora a gente não possa negar que a pesquisa e a colocação de melhores empresas para se trabalhar seja indubitavelmente de valor para se entender melhores e piores empresas, até que ponto não há um excessivo foco nos fatores que, pelo menos nós que trabalhamos com recursos humanos, claramente lidamos com a questão do higiênico, ou seja, das condições de trabalho e menos em organização do trabalho, ou seja, até que ponto há um foco bastante importante em comunicação, o quanto que as pessoas têm bem-estar em ali estar, quanto que o foco é na retenção das pessoas, quanto que o foco em que as pessoas possam colocar opinião, mas até que ponto nós não estamos dando pouca ou menos atenção a questões como saúde física, saúde integral, como aqui está se colocando, a questão do espaço maior, que o Carlos estava falando sobre um espaço maior para concepção e menos para execução do trabalho apenas, para você tentar diminuir, e essa é uma das questões que apareceu, a grande lacuna que havia entre o trabalho de mera execução e o trabalho de concepção e os N filtros que existem entre um e outro. Eu acho que essa é uma pergunta importante porque ela traz de volta a questão da qualidade de vida no trabalho. Se uma organização produz confiança, produz orgulho e produz um ambiente de trabalho saudável, que as pessoas se gostam, até que ponto isso é suficiente para que seja um excelente lugar para se trabalhar? Até que ponto a gente tem que olhar se ela é um lugar saudável também? Se ao final do período o indivíduo é um indivíduo mais inteiro ou no mínimo mais saudável? Se eu não, Ana Maria, se eu não completei, se a sua questão não está no meio, me corrija.
The quick answer to that is that it's very difficult to listen to Portuguese when you're speaking English and vice versa. The quick answer to that is a subject that we do look at very specifically. We have some questions on the survey on that, both in terms of the environment, the physical environment, whether it's an attractive environment, so, and then also the question of safety, physical safety, that health issues are primary. But in terms of the model that I described before, these are both respect issues. If people don't feel that the physical environment is safe and pleasant, then they don't feel respected.
Não é possível ter um ambiente de trabalho bom, positivo, se as condições básicas de saúde não estão adequadamente equacionadas e resolvidas. Em qualquer ação de qualidade de vida, uma das preocupações é exatamente a questão da saúde, a questão do equilíbrio emocional e das condições físicas do trabalho. Por uma razão básica, quem conhece a nossa cidade, tem as agruras de viver numa cidade como a nossa, e a felicidade também de viver nessa cidade, sabe que o processo de chegar ao local de trabalho em São Paulo já é complicado. Em segundo lugar, ele chega ao trabalho onde ele coloca o seu automóvel ou alguma coisa que possa se assemelhar a isso, dependendo da renda do indivíduo, né? Se eu for para camadas, vamos dizer assim, de colaboradores com renda inferior, etc., nós sabemos que toda a agrura que o indivíduo despende de até 4 ou 5 horas de transporte coletivo na cidade. Então, o local de trabalho pode se tornar efetivamente, não digo um oásis, mas ele precisa ter condições básicas, mínimas, saudáveis e de um conforto para que a pessoa possa viver. Eu acho que isso é imprescindível. A gente não pode imaginar nada em termos de qualidade de vida se nós não temos o básico, o mínimo necessário de conforto, de segurança e que lhe dá essa condição. Portanto, qualquer programa, qualquer processo, eu prefiro a palavra processo de qualidade de vida, parte dessas premissas. Se não tiver essas premissas, eu acho que precisa primeiro resolvê-las. E depois tentar alguma coisa mais sofisticada em termos de clima organizacional, de envolvimento, de comunicação, etc., etc., que é importante. Mas isso é a base. Sem isso, não creio que possa funcionar nada.
Bom, eu lamento dizer que meus esforços foram mal sucedidos, não estão me deixando continuar em função das outras atividades do evento, e isso é compreensível. Só gostaria de fazer um rápido resumo e pedir para as pessoas que, por favor, ainda bem que algumas se identificaram, procurem diretamente as pessoas do seu preferência. Na verdade, nem todas foram para o Robert, muitas são para a questão da Nestlé, algumas perguntando como conseguiram, outras como é que podem compartilhar isso com outras empresas que estão chegando lá.
Eu me comprometo a levar, tem o nome, identificação e eu me comprometo a responder.
Como conseguimos compartilhar isso com outros locais? Outras perguntas que foram feitas diz respeito a como conseguir, quando seja na pesquisa ou seja por autodiagnóstico, aqui as pessoas veem que suas organizações têm problemas de confiança, têm problemas de acesso, tem problema dessa história da comunicação de duas vias, como fazer para resolver essas questões na prática, algumas questões metodológicas, algumas questões também lembram um pouco aquela primeira pergunta que eu fiz, até que ponto a gente está falando somente de fatores extrínsecos e fatores higiênicos, e outras perguntas, que é uma das que eu gostaria de fazer, é como é que a gente insere tudo isso no nosso país, que não é só de empresas grandes, de empresas desenvolvidas, que é marcado por uma enorme, de uma dificuldade econômica, em que, ao invés de retenção, a empresa está muito focada em, às vezes, diminuir. Como é que faz isso no meio dessas reestruturações? Como é que a gente faz isso num país que está cheio de contrastes, em que ao lado de Nestlé, Siemens, etc., nós temos organizações que parecem saídas do século passado? Como é que a gente faz onde há enorme contraste, como o Carlos colocou, entre execução e concepção? Como é que se faz para fazer isso tudo num país em que culturalmente a gente está tão perto de uma mania nacional da gente separar a imagem, né, o que parece ser um ótimo lugar de se trabalhar, e a substância, o que de fato é. Mas essa é a parte da conversa que vocês não, graças a Deus, não vão ouvir de minha parte. Eu queria, antes de mais nada, agradecer a todos que estão aqui, inclusive aos palestrantes. A organização da conferência está dando essas... Ana Cristina, se você quiser algum comentário, está dando estas lembranças da sua vinda aqui. Muito obrigado.
Uma salva de palmas, então, gente.